The ship had been dead for 11 years. Everyone knew that. The wreckage of the Caliph-7 drifted at the edge of the Thresh Nebula like a broken tooth, no power signature, no oxygen trace, no reason for anyone to go near it. The war that destroyed it was over. The species that built it were gone. 3 separate survey drones had confirmed the same thing in 3 separate decades. Empty. Cold. Dead. So when Lieutenant Commander Dax Mercer volunteered to do a manual sweep of the hull alone, no backup, no extraction team on standby, his commanding officer didn't argue. She just looked at him the way people look at someone who has already decided something, and signed the clearance form. Dax wasn't looking for salvage. He wasn't looking for intel, or technology, or anything the Alliance could weaponize or monetize or put in a report. He was looking for his brother's body. 3 hours into the sweep, chest deep in frozen wreckage, his suit light cutting through 11 years of dark, he found something else instead. A door that had been forced open from the inside. Recently. And, behind it, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a dead ship in a dead system, was a woman who looked at him like she had been waiting, not hoping, not praying, waiting, with the patient certainty of someone who had done the math and knew he was coming. She had 4 eyes. 2 of them were closed. The open ones were the color of a star going out. She said one word in a language Dax's translator didn't recognize, and then, she said it again in standard, slowly, like she was teaching a child, late. This is the story of what happened after that word. It is not a love story, though love is in it. It is not a war story, though war made it. It is the story of a man who went looking for a ghost and found something that would cost him everything he thought he understood about survival, loyalty, and what it means to be the last one left. It starts with a dead ship. It ends somewhere neither of them expected. The Caliph-7 looked worse up close. Dax had seen the recon photos, of course. Everyone who had served in the Thresh campaign had seen them. The Alliance used the image in briefings for years afterward, a cautionary slide about what happens when a Rel warship catches you mid-jump with no countermeasures armed. In the photos, the vessel looked almost peaceful. A long, silver-gray fracture floating against the nebula's bruised purple glow. Distant enough to be beautiful. Distant enough to be someone else's problem. Up close, it was something you felt in your back teeth. The Caliph-7 had been a troop carrier. Mid-range, Alliance-built, designed to move 800 soldiers from staging point to drop zone without wasting too much fuel on comfort. It had been on its 3rd run of the Thresh campaign when the Rel hit it at the worst possible moment, mid-jump, shields cycling, crew split between battle stations and the mess hall. The ship had come out of jump in 3 pieces. The largest piece was what Dax was looking at now through the scratched visor of his EVA suit. 412 people had been on that ship. 31 had made it to the escape pods. Marcus Mercer had not been one of them. Dax had been 19 when he got the notification. A standard Alliance casualty form, the kind generated automatically when a soldier's biometric chip went dark. No body recovered. No remains. Just a timestamp and a set of coordinates and a box checked, presumed deceased in action, Thresh sector, day 214, he was 31 now. He had spent 12 years learning how to be a soldier because Marcus had been a soldier. He had spent 12 years requesting transfer after transfer, working his way up to clearance levels that could authorize personal EVA surveys, because the Alliance didn't spend resources recovering bodies from dead ships in inactive sectors, and Dax had never fully accepted that Marcus was just floating somewhere in all that cold dark without anyone coming to find him. He keyed his thrusters and moved toward the hull. The exterior of the wreck was a museum of violence. 12 years of micro-impacts had pitted every surface. Structural panels had buckled and refrozen into shapes that didn't match any blueprint. The main hull breach, the one that had split the ship, gaped open on the starboard side like a mouth that had been screaming for over a decade and, finally, run out of air. Dax moved along the port side instead, sweeping his suit light in slow arcs, cataloging, methodical. His suit recorder was running. His pulse was where he needed it. He had done this before. Not here, never here, but on other wreck sites, other campaign debris. You learn to separate the work from the weight of it. You learn to let the checklist carry you when your own feet wouldn't. sector by sector, panel by panel. His suit's atmosphere sensors registered nothing. No oxygen. No heat variance. The internal temperature of the wreck was 7 degrees above absolute zero, which was close enough to the same thing. His locator was pinging off the old ship's identification beacon, still running on decay power after all these years, still broadcasting the ship's name and registration into empty space, still insisting to anyone who cared to listen that the Caliph 7 was an active Alliance vessel that should be given right of way. Nobody had told the beacon the war was over. He found the first hatch on the port side 40 minutes in. Sealed. He worked the manual override, a standard Alliance lock, same design they'd been using for 40 years, and the hatch ground open with a vibration he felt through his gloves rather than heard. Vacuum doesn't carry sound. He pulled himself inside. The interior corridor was dark and still and catastrophically cold. Ice had formed on every surface, thin and crystalline, catching his suit light and throwing it back in fragments. A bench along one wall still had someone's jacket frozen to it, arms spread wide, like the person who'd worn it had simply evaporated mid-sitting. A scattering of personal items lay frozen to the floor, a card's deck, a photograph sealed in a plastic sleeve, a boots that had come unlaced. The ordinary debris of interrupted lives. Dax moved through it the way he moved through all of it. Carefully. Slowly. Without letting his chest do what it wanted to do. He worked inward over the next 2 hours. The ship's internal layout matched the schematics he had memorized. He had memorized them the way some people memorize prayers, because they gave him a shape to move toward when everything else felt formless. Troop barracks on decks 4 and 5. Engineering below that. The command module in the bow section, which had been the piece that sheared away in the jump failure and was now drifting roughly 600 kilometers spinward of the main hull. He wasn't going to the command module. Marcus had been assigned to Deck 5, Berth 12C, 3rd Platoon, Baker Company. He had known that since he was 19 years old. He found the stairwell junction at the center of the ship and started down. Deck 5 was worse than the upper corridors. The Rel's initial strike had hit somewhere near midship, and the blast damage was visible here in ways that the upper decks had largely escaped. Bulkheads twisted inward, lighting fixtures melted to the ceiling, one entire section of corridor pinched shut by structural collapse so complete it looked almost intentional, like the ship had tried to fold itself closed around the wound. He had to route around it, consulting his suit's schematic overlay, picking his way through a service corridor that smelled of nothing because vacuum smelled of nothing, though his brain kept insisting otherwise. He was 3 berths away from 12C when his suit's motion sensor chirped. He stopped. The motion sensor on an EVA suit was designed for debris tracking, chunks of hull, drifting equipment, anything large enough to register as a collision hazard. It was not designed to detect life, because life was not supposed to be in locations like this. Dax looked at the readout. Small motion signature. Consistent rhythm. Coming from the corridor ahead. His hand moved to the sidearm he'd brought more out of habit than expectation. He moved forward. The door to berth 12C was sealed. Same standard Alliance lock as the hatch above. But the lock casing was scratched deeply, repeatedly scratched, from the inside, the marks of something working at it from the wrong direction over a long period of time. He stared at those scratches for a long moment. Then, he worked the override. The door opened. She was sitting in the center of the berth floor, cross-legged, her hands resting on her knees with the open, deliberate posture of someone who had chosen this position. Not collapsed. Not curled. Composed in a way that shouldn't have been possible in a room that had been 7 degrees above absolute zero for 11 years. She was wearing what appeared to be a survival suit, not Alliance issue, something else, something that had clearly been repaired multiple times with materials that weren't originally part of it. Patches of hull polymer. Strips of insulation foam. The suit was running on something, because it was keeping her alive, but Dax had no idea what. She had 4 eyes arranged in 2 horizontal pairs, upper set dark, closed, lower set open, pale gold going gray at the edges, the color of a pulsar photographed mid-decay. Her skin was deep blue-black with a faint iridescent pattern that shifted when his suit light hit it from different angles. Her hair, if it was hair, was white and moved very slightly despite the absence of atmosphere. She looked at him. She said one word he didn't understand. Then, she said, in standard, with perfect pronunciation and the cadence of someone who had practiced the sentence until it was a stone-worn smooth, late. Dax stood in the doorway of a dead berth on a dead ship and stared at a woman who should not have been alive, and his suit's atmosphere sensors continued to register nothing, and his motion sensor continued to ping her steady breathing, and, he thought, with the particular clarity that comes when your brain has stopped arguing with your eyes, that his commanding officer was going to have strong opinions about this debrief. He said, because it was the only thing he could think of to say, "You speak standard." She blinked. Both sets of eyes, the lower open ones and the upper closed ones, moved, the upper lid shifting slightly as if registering something through tissue. "I learned," she said. "The ship's computer had language archives. I had time." "How much time?" "Your years?" A pause. A calculation behind those gray gold eyes. 11. And some months. He heard that land somewhere deep and central, and he made a deliberate choice not to feel it yet. Not here. Not now. "You've been on this ship for 11 years. Yes. Alive. Clearly. How?" She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read, not impatience, not quite. Something that had moved past impatience so long ago it had come around the other side and arrived at something like philosophical resignation. "That," she said, "is a long answer. And I would like to give it somewhere that is not here." She looked at the door he was standing in. "Your ship. You have a ship. I have a scout shuttle. That is a ship." He didn't move immediately. He was running the numbers, the way a soldier runs numbers: threat assessment, resource allocation, chain of command implications. She had been in this room for 11 years. She had learned standard from a dead ship's computer banks. She was alive by means he couldn't explain, in conditions that should have been impossible. She was an alien species he didn't recognize, which meant she hadn't been on the Caliph 7 as crew or passenger. She had gotten on after, or had been here before, or something else entirely that fit none of the categories he had for this situation. She watched him running the numbers with an expression that suggested she had expected exactly this pause and had already decided what came after it. "You came looking for someone," she said. It wasn't a question. His hand, still on the sidearm he hadn't drawn, went still. "Yes. Berth 12C was a man. Human. Young." She paused. "He was here when I first came aboard. He was the last one on the ship. We spoke, briefly, before the life support on this deck failed." Another pause, and in it something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anything else he had a name for. "He was not afraid. I wanted you to know that. He was not afraid." Dax stood in the doorway for 4 more seconds. Then, he holstered the sidearm, moved into the berth, and crouched down in front of her so they were level. "My shuttle has a habitat module. Warmth. Air. I can get you there." He looked at the patched survival suit, the repaired panels, the 11 years of improvised maintenance. "Can you move?" She unfolded from the floor with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who has been conserving energy so long that every movement has become a considered decision. "I have been waiting to move," she said, "for 11 years. He got her to the shuttle. And, somewhere in the 6-hour transit back to the Ardent, as she sat across from him in the habitat module breathing actual air for what she said was the first time in over a decade, he thought about the casualty form. The timestamp. The coordinates. The box checked. Presumed deceased *. He thought about what she had said. He was not afraid, he let that be enough for now. He looked at the woman across from him, alive, strange, patient as geology, watching him with eyes the color of dying stars, and understood that whatever he had come to the Caliph 7 to find, he had found something else instead. He hadn't found an ending. He had found a beginning he didn't have a category for yet. Outside the shuttle, the Thresh Nebula burned its slow purple burn, and the wreck of the Caliph 7 drifted behind them, still broadcasting its name into empty space. Still insisting it was an active vessel. Still asking for right-of-way. Her name was Valif. Not the ship's name. She was careful to point that out on the second day, with the patient precision of someone who had anticipated the confusion and, preemptively, found it irritating. The ship had been designated Caliph 7 by Alliance Registry. She was Valith. Different word, different language, different meaning entirely, and she said the two words side by side so he could hear the distinction, and then, she looked at him with those pale gold eyes and waited for the acknowledgement she clearly felt the distinction deserved. Valith, he repeated. Yes. And, your people? What are they called? A pause that went on long enough to become its own kind of answer. Were, she said finally. What were they called? He didn't push on that. He had learned, in the 3 days since bringing her aboard the Ardent, that there were doors in her conversation that swung open and doors that had been welded shut so long the seams had rusted over, and that trying to tell the difference in advance was mostly guesswork. What he had learned to do was watch her eyes, the lower pair, because the upper set remained closed except in moments he hadn't fully catalogued yet, and wait for the particular quality of stillness that meant she was deciding whether to continue or withdraw. This was a withdrawal. He let it be one. The Ardent was an Alliance patrol corvette, mid-class, crew of 62, currently assigned to a mapping survey in the outer Thresh sector that everyone on board understood was the Alliance's polite way of saying you were stationed somewhere nothing happens so that nothing can happen to you. Commander Yara Osei had accepted Dax's unusual passenger with the exact level of controlled professional alarm that Dax had expected, had installed Valith in a medbay observation room with the exact combination of care and containment protocol that the situation demanded, and had been very clear with Dax in private that the moment they were within communication range of an Alliance relay station, she was filing a full report and that whatever came next was above both of their pay grades. Dax had no disagreement with any of this. What he had was 6 days of transit time before the relay station, during which he was the only member of the crew that Valith would speak to. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. She had been polite to the medical officer. She had been scrupulously non-threatening to the security personnel who did the initial scan. She had answered Commander Osei's formal interview questions with careful, complete sentences that gave precise information and volunteered nothing. But, when the interviews and the scans were over and the room was quiet, she stopped talking. She sat in the same cross-legged posture he had found her in on the Caliph 7, her hands on her knees, her lower eyes open, and she waited. When Dax came, she talked. He started to understand on the second day that she wasn't choosing him out of comfort or familiarity. She was choosing him because he had been looking for his brother. Because he had come to a dead ship and a dead system with no backup and no extraction plan, driven by something that had nothing to do with orders or strategy or any reasonable calculation of risk versus reward. She recognized that thing. She had a different word for it in her language, she said at once and didn't translate it, but the shape of the recognition was clear enough. She had come to the Caliph 7 looking for something too. She told him on the third day. She had been a biological researcher, the word she used was closer to chronicler, she explained, something between scientist and historian, a keeper of genetic and ecological records. Her people, the ones whose name she used in past tense, had been a spacefaring civilization for roughly 3,000 years by their own reckoning. Not expansionist. Not militaristic. They had moved through the galaxy with the specific interest of people who found other life forms profoundly worth documenting, and they had been very careful, in 3,000 years of careful, to avoid entangling themselves in the wars of civilizations younger and faster and more prone to violence than themselves. They had, ultimately, failed at this. She didn't tell him how. Not on the third day. She told him the outcome. Her people's central archive world had been struck during a conflict between two other species that had nothing to do with them, caught in the crossfire of a war they hadn't participated in, destroyed in the particular efficient way that war destroys things that aren't designed to resist it. She had been in the field when it happened. A research mission to an uninhabited system 3 sectors away. She had come back to coordinates that no longer contained anything she recognized. What she had been doing on the Caliph 7 was more complicated. She had tracked a data fragment, a partial record from one of her civilization's secondary archive ships, which had been transmitting a distress beacon before it too went silent, to the Thresh Nebula. Not to the Caliph 7 specifically. To the general region. She had been moving through the wreck field on a salvage shuttle when the Alliance's automated security perimeter, still active, still treating the Thresh wreckage as a potential hazard zone 11 years after the campaign ended, had disabled her shuttle remotely, as it disabled everything that didn't have proper Alliance ID codes, and she had made it to the nearest large structure before her shuttle's life support gave out entirely. The nearest large structure had been the Calith 7. She had gotten aboard. She had found the ship's last survivor, a young human soldier, badly injured, who had lasted another 3 weeks on emergency life support before the system failed. She had sat with him at the end. It was, she said, the least she could do. He had not been afraid. After that, she had started working on the problem of not dying. 11 years. Dax sat with that number in the medbay observation room on the 4th day, watching her eat the protein rations she had accepted with an expression of careful neutrality. They were clearly not anything she would have chosen, but she ate them with methodical thoroughness because they were fuel and, she had learned, across 11 years, to be efficient about fuel. He thought about what 11 years of that looked like. Not trapped in ice, not in stasis, not asleep. Awake. Working. Improvising. Maintaining a survival suit with cannibalized ship parts. Learning standard from a dead computer's archive. Doing the math, apparently, on who might eventually come to this particular section of the ship and deciding to be in that room when they did. How did you know someone would come to berth 12C? He asked. She looked up from the ration packet. I didn't know. I thought it was probable. Why? Because he told me about his brother. She set the ration down. He talked about you quite a lot, in the 3 weeks we had. He said you were stubborn in the way that some people are brave, not because you didn't feel the fear, but because the feeling of the fear didn't change what you were going to do. She paused. He said that when he was gone, you would come. That it might take a long time, but that you would come. The med bay was very quiet. Dax looked at the wall above her head, a patch of gray Alliance standard bulkhead with a ventilation grate. Absolutely unremarkable, and he looked at it for a long time because it was there and it didn't require anything of him. He was right, he said finally. Yes, she said. He was. On the 5th day, she showed him what she had been protecting. It was a data core, approximately the size of a human fist, made from a material that his suit sensors had flagged as unknown during the initial scan. She had kept it inside the lining of the survival suit for 11 years, and she removed it with the careful deliberateness of someone performing a ritual they have performed many times. She held it out to him, not offering, just showing, and, even in the flat LED light of the med bay, the material caught the light in a way that suggested depth, as if the object was larger on the inside than its exterior implied. This is what remains, she said. What remained was the primary species record of her civilization. Genetic sequences for every documented lifeform they had catalogued in 3,000 years of work. Ecological histories. Migration maps. Biological blueprints detailed enough, she said, to reconstruct organisms from scratch if you had the right technology. It was not her people's whole history, not their art, their language, their internal stories. Just the science. The accumulated knowledge of 3,000 years of careful watching. She had been trying to get it to her civilization's last known secondary archive for 11 years. She was, as far as she knew, the only member of her species still alive. Dax looked at the data core. He looked at the woman holding it. He thought about the specific weight of being the last keeper of something, and about how she had sat in that dead room for over a decade, keeping it. The secondary archive, he said. Do you still have the coordinates? She looked at him with the lower set of her eyes, and the upper set, the closed ones, shifted again in that way he had started to recognize, the way they moved when something registered beyond the normal range. Yes. Then, that is where we're going, he said, and he said it the way Marcus apparently used to describe him, not as if the fear wasn't there, but as if the fear wasn't the deciding factor. She looked at him for a long moment. The Alliance, she said. Your commander. The report she is filing. I know. You could lose your commission. I know that too. Why? She wasn't challenging him. She was asking the way scientists ask, with genuine curiosity, wanting the actual answer, not the comfortable one. Dax thought about that. He thought about a 19-year-old getting a casualty form. He thought about 12 years of working toward a clearance level that would let him go to a dead ship in an empty sector and bring his brother something, anything, even just the fact of having been looked for. He thought about the specific kind of stubbornness Marcus had apparently described to a stranger in the 3 weeks before the end. Because he sat with you when you were a stranger on a ship that was killing him, Dax said. And because you sat with him. And because 3,000 years of watching the universe carefully is worth more than my commission. He stood up. And because you've been waiting in a cold room long enough. She didn't smile. He was still learning her face, and he wasn't sure smiling was a thing it did, but something in the set of her jaw changed, the faintest shift, like a door deciding to open rather than stay closed. Your brother was right about you, she said. He took that with him when he left the room. He took it to Commander Osei's office, and laid out his full argument, and watched her face cycle through 7 different expressions in under 2 minutes. He took it through her counter-arguments and her very reasonable points about Alliance protocol and the implications of a foreign data core and the fact that the secondary archives coordinates might take them into sectors currently under transit restriction. He took it all the way to the part where she stopped arguing and looked at him with the expression she had used when she signed his EVA clearance, the one that meant she already knew what the outcome was going to be and had decided she could live with it. 3 days, she said. I file the report when we hit the relay. Whatever comes after that is above our pay grade. But I will give you 3 days of creative navigation before we reach the relay. 3 days. It wasn't nothing. Outside the Ardent, the Thresh Nebula thinned to trailing wisps of violet gas, and the deep black of open space opened up ahead of them, full of archive coordinates and restricted sectors and things that were worth protecting, and Dax went back to the medbay and told Valeth they had 3 days. She uncrossed her legs. She stood up. She picked up the data core and held it the way you hold the only copy of something that has to reach the other side. Then, we should not waste them, she said. The secondary archive was at the edge of a system the Alliance charts labeled uninhabited, survey incomplete, and had never bothered to finish surveying because it contained no habitable planets, no mineral resources worth extracting, and no strategic value to anyone running a war. The people who had built the archive there had chosen it for exactly those reasons. The system's star was old and dim, a K-type dwarf burning slow and red, patient as anything that has been burning for 8 billion years. 3 gas giants orbited it at varying distances, their moons barren and cratered. The archive station orbited the smallest moon of the outermost giant, tucked against the shadow of the cratered rock like something trying not to be noticed, which was what it had been trying to do for over a century. When the Ardent dropped out of transit at the system's edge, the archive station responded to Valeth's identification code with a signal so weak it took their communications array 20 minutes to separate it from background noise. But it responded. Dax watched Valeth receive that signal. He had been watching her for 6 days. He had started to learn the grammar of her expressions, the small, contained vocabulary of a face that had spent 11 years practicing not wanting things too openly in case the wanting made the loss worse. He had learned that the upper set of eyes, the closed ones, opened slightly when she was processing something difficult. He had learned that her hands, normally still as her posture, moved when she was thinking through a problem, her fingers moving against each other in sequences too regular to be random. He had started to understand that what read as composure from the outside was actually a very precise and practiced form of endurance, and that the woman who had said late to him in that dead berth with perfect calm had been holding herself together with the kind of structural engineering that doesn't look like effort until something finally goes right. Something was finally going right. She pressed her hand flat against the communications console and she didn't make a sound, but her upper eyelids opened, fully, for the first time since he'd found her, and the eyes beneath were a deep and overwhelming amber, nothing like the pale gray gold of the lower set, lit from within in a way that had absolutely no physiological explanation he could construct. She closed them again in less than 3 seconds. But he had seen them. He looked away, because some things are too private for witnesses. Commander Osei brought the Ardent in on a slow approach, careful, deliberate, the careful of someone who did not know what she was approaching and had made professional peace with that uncertainty. The archive station was larger than the external profile suggested. The parts visible from outside were mostly docking apparatus and communication arrays, the working surface of something that extended deep into the moon rock below. Power readings were minimal but consistent. Life support readings were non-existent, which Valeth had expected. "No one is alive on the station," she said, when the sensor reports came in. There would not be. The station was automated. Designed to maintain itself. For how long? Osei asked. As long as necessary. She paused. My people built things to last. It was a philosophical position. The docking was straightforward. The station accepted the Ardennes docking clamps with the patient cooperation of infrastructure that had been waiting for something to dock with for a very long time and had not given up. The inner airlock cycled correctly. The lights came on at the approach of living bodies, and the air recyclers spun up, and the temperature in the entry corridor went from bone cold to something merely uncomfortable in under 10 minutes. Dax went in with Valeth and a 3-person security team that Commander Osei had insisted on, and that Valeth had accepted with the graciousness of someone who understood the institutional need for security teams even when they were unnecessary. The station interior was precise and spare in a way that matched what Dax had come to understand about Valeth's people. Everything had a clear function. Nothing was wasted. The corridors were narrow not because space was limited but because the design philosophy held that you shouldn't build corridors wider than people needed to walk through them, because that space could be used for archives instead. The walls on either side were lined with storage cells, thousands of them, each the size of a shoebox, each sealed and labeled in a script that Dax couldn't read, but Valeth moved through like it was home. She stopped at intervals, reading labels, touching surfaces, tracking something with a system he didn't have access to. She moved deeper into the station with increasing sureness, the tentative quality she had carried on the Arden falling away increment by increment, like a person remembering how to walk on solid ground after years at sea. He followed. They went down 4 levels. At the bottom level, she stopped in front of a door that was larger than the others, sealed with a more complex mechanism, and she placed the data core, the one she had carried inside her suit for 11 years, into a receiving port beside the door. The port read it. A sound moved through the station's walls, felt more than heard, a deep subsonic hum of systems coming awake. The lights in the bottom corridor shifted from emergency amber to something warmer. The temperature ticked up 3 degrees. The door opened. Inside was a room the size of a small warehouse, every wall lined floor to ceiling with archive cells, and, in the center of the room, a single console, and, on the console, a light that had been blinking in the deep dark for over a decade, waiting for someone to come and see it. Valeth walked to the console. She placed both hands flat on the surface. The room lit up. Dax stood at the doorway and watched 3,000 years of patient work announce itself, data flowing across every display surface in the room, catalogs and records and genetic sequences and ecological maps of planets he would never visit, creatures he would never see, whole chapters of living history that had no other copies anywhere in the galaxy. The data core's contents were uploading into the main system, integrating, completing something that had been incomplete for 11 years. The light on the console stopped blinking. It went steady. He had brought a soldier's practical mind to this job for 12 years. He had built a career on the useful disciplines, threat assessment, strategic patience, the particular clarity that comes from accepting that you cannot control everything and, then, proceeding anyway. He was not a man prone to being overwhelmed by things. He stood in the doorway of that archive room and felt something move through him that he didn't have a name for. Not awe, exactly. Something older than awe. The feeling of standing in the presence of something that had survived not because it was powerful but because someone had cared enough about it to keep it alive against every reasonable probability. He thought about Marcus. He thought about 3 weeks of emergency life support and a young soldier who had not been afraid and a stranger from a dying civilization who had sat with him anyway. He thought about what it costs to be the last keeper of something. Valeth stood at the console for a long time without speaking. When she finally turned around, her lower eyes were dry and her upper eyes were closed and her face had the particular quality of someone who has just set down something very heavy and is taking a moment to understand what their hands feel like without it. It's all here, she said. Everything that was in the core. Everything the station already had. All of it. She paused. It was not lost. No, Dax said. It wasn't. They went back to the Arden carrying none of what they had brought down, because the data core was uploaded, the archive was live, and the only thing left to carry was the question of what came next. Commander Osei had questions. Reasonable ones. The report she had filed at the relay station, 3 days back, had generated responses from 3 different Alliance departments, and 2 of those departments had questions about the archive station and 1 of them had questions about Valeth specifically, and Osei laid all of this out in her office with the steady professional directness of someone who had done her job correctly and was now managing the downstream effects of other people doing their jobs correctly. Valeth listened to all of it with her hands on her knees and her lower eyes tracking Osei with the focused attention of a woman who had learned standard from a dead ship's computer and was not going to miss a word. When Osei finished, Valeth spoke. She spoke for 40 minutes. She told Osei, and through her the 3 Alliance departments waiting for answers about her civilization's 3,000 years of cataloging work. She told them the archive station's location and access codes. She told them what the archive contained and what it could offer to researchers, to biologists, to ecologists, to the kinds of people who spent their careers trying to understand how life worked and why it was worth protecting. She told them that she had no territorial claims and no political agenda and no interest in anything the Alliance could offer her except the one thing she was going to ask for regardless of whether they offered it: she wanted to stay. Not on the Arden specifically. She wanted to stay in this sector, near the archive, in whatever capacity the Alliance would sanction. She wanted to continue the work her people had started. She wanted to keep cataloging. She was the last one. She was going to keep doing it. Osei looked at her for a long moment. Then, she looked at Dax, who was standing by the door of her office because he had not been technically invited to this meeting and had come anyway, and Osei had decided this was consistent with his general approach to authorization. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who was filing a second unusual report today and had made her peace with being the kind of commander who filed unusual reports. "I'll put in the request," she said. "No guarantees." "No guarantees," Valeth agreed. "I know." 3 weeks later, the Alliance approved a temporary research designation for the archive station, pending formal review by the Xenological Studies Division. Valeth's status was classified as non-combatant research affiliate, which was a category the Alliance had invented specifically for her because she didn't fit any existing one, which seemed correct to Dax. He filed a request for extended sector assignment. It was approved. He wasn't entirely sure why he had filed it. The practical reasons were solid enough: the archive required security coordination, the sector was his operational area, Valeth's unique status created logistical considerations that benefited from having a designated Alliance point of contact. All of this was true. He put it in the request form and it was true, and it was also not the whole truth, and he was honest enough with himself to know that. The whole truth was that she had been waiting in a cold room for 11 years because she had something worth protecting, and his brother had told her someone would come, and the someone had come, and now she was not waiting anymore, and Dax was not fully ready to walk away from that. From what it felt like to be the person who had finally shown up. He told her this, approximately. Not all of it. Not the part about not being ready to walk away. Just the part about the sector assignment and the logistical considerations. She listened with her lower eyes on him and her upper lids in that almost open position that meant she was processing something beyond the literal. "You could have gone back to your regular posting," she said. "I could have. The archive does not require a standing security presence. The Alliance's interim designation does not mandate one." "No." She looked at him. "Your brother would find this very consistent with your character." He almost laughed. It was the closest he had come to laughing in longer than he wanted to calculate. Probably. Something in her face did the thing that might have been the way she smiled, the subtle rearrangement he had been trying to classify for weeks. "Then, I am glad," she said. "The work is better with someone to describe it to." Dax looked at her, alive, patient, carrying 3,000 years of careful watching in a data core she had kept inside her suit for 11 years against every probability, and, now here, free of it, still watching with those pale gold eyes, and he thought that Marcus had been 19 years old and not afraid and had somehow arranged, in the last weeks of his life, for this exact outcome. He thought that was the most Marcus thing in the galaxy. Outside the archive station, the red dwarf star burned slow and steady, 8 billion years into its long patience, and the moon's cratered surface held the station against it, and, inside the station, 3,000 years of careful observation waited for the next person to come and continue it. It was not lost. It had never been lost, as long as there was one person left who refused to let it be. Dax sat down across from Valeth in the small coordination office they had set up on the station's upper level, and he asked her to tell him about the first species her civilization had ever documented, the very first entry in the archive, 3,000 years back, and she began to speak, and her upper eyes opened in that full amber blaze, just briefly, and then settled again, and outside the stars did what stars do. They burned. They kept burning. That was enough.